The movie had only been online for a day, but it had already garnered praise from millions of viewers. The film's highly realistic depiction of apocalyptic scenes, coupled with the involvement of many current Special Forces soldiers as actors, contributed to its acclaim. Next up, let's enjoy the thrilling apocalypse blockbuster Black Crab. It was the first time the woman attempted to drive out. She intended to wait quietly at the red light, but she saw others fleeing in panic. Caroline was about to open the door to check what was happening when sudden gunfire startled her back into the car. Her daughter Vanya, sitting behind her, asked what was going on. Just then, a woman running towards them was shot dead right in front of their eyes. Terrified, Vanya wanted to get out of the car and run, but Caroline pulled her back. They dared not make a sound as the armed thugs approached closer. At that moment, a thug suddenly smashed the car window with a gun butt, and mother and daughter fell into darkness. The scene shifted to the inside of a frost-covered train filled with piercing screams. Civilians were corralled by the military like livestock, serving as food to get them through the harsh winter. Hunger forced them to beg the officer for some food. The officer was unmoved. He had his men open the train door. Inside was a group of armed people. Still unable to find a sense of safety, they huddled together for warmth. A flashlight beam landed on a woman in red. The officer outside called her name. It was Caroline. Caroline stepped out of the train, carrying her luggage. Seeing Caroline get off the train, the officer handed her a document and said, "Someone at the food distribution point will take you to the address on this paper." Caroline then set off towards her destination. As Caroline was looking around for road signs, a woman suddenly appeared and asked if Caroline was hungry. Then, she handed Caroline the remaining food in her bowl. In this sunless, food-scarce society, the famished Caroline took the food without hesitation and started eating ravenously. The woman then inquired about the front lines, wanting to know the whereabouts of her husband. Caroline kindly warned her to run quickly, as this place was about to be slaughtered. It seemed Caroline knew a lot. At that moment, a lieutenant called Caroline's name. He was Caroline's contact. After checking Caroline's documents, he took her into the car. As the car drove through the city, Caroline saw ruins everywhere, and the streets were filled with people scavenging for food and fleeing. Under the overpass, there were deserters hanging. The man drove to a street, then said he needed to get something and left Caroline in the car, instructing her not to wander off. When he didn't return for a long time, Caroline decided to get out and look around. A woman approached Caroline, asking if she had any food as her child was starving, but a man suddenly pointed a gun at Caroline's head. Then, after dealing with the people, Caroline hurriedly drove away, heading to the mission base. After a friendly inspection, the soldiers escorted Caroline to a hall inside the base. Inside, Malik greeted Caroline warmly. Granvik joined in the conversation. They began speculating why they had been summoned here. As they spoke, a female captain announced that they could enter. They entered the base's conference room. A colonel emerged from the room. After Rod sat down, he had Forsberg brief Caroline and the others on the mission they needed to carry out. Through Forsberg's briefing, they understood why they had been called here. They had suffered a defeat. The enemy had crushed all their defenses with overwhelming force. In a few days, the enemy would be here, but they had one last chance. A chance not only to turn the tide but to end the war for good. So, Rod began to explain the mission details to them. Because the 37-year-long winter had covered both the land and coast with glaciers, making it impossible for cars and boats to pass, they would have to cross the ice by skating. This was why they were chosen. Their mission was to carry 2 canisters across the ice to a research base in Adi. Rod promised them freedom if they succeeded. Rod said this was not a request but an order, then commanded the group to disperse. Rod asked Caroline to stay behind. He said the others were chosen specifically to assist Caroline in completing the mission. Among them, only Caroline had the best skating skills and knew the terrain there. However, Caroline refused, believing the mission was a death sentence. Reluctantly, Rod showed her a photo of her daughter and told her that her daughter was in the refugee camp at the mission's destination. Thinking her daughter had died, Caroline was suddenly motivated to go to Adi, knowing her daughter was still alive and at the mission's destination. When Caroline returned to the gathering point, Forsberg arrived and told Caroline's group to pack up quickly and leave before dark. The scene shifted, and Caroline was awakened by the sound of artillery fire mixed with Forsberg's urging. They quickly packed up and followed Forsberg out. An officer drove up from the opposite side and quickly took 2 canisters out of a box. The officer instructed them never to open the canisters under any circumstances and not to let them fall into enemy hands. He also added a new member, Nyland, to their team. They arrived at the ice and, under the cover of night, began their hellish mission. There were no words along the way. From night to day, the wreckage of planes beside them turned into cold ice sculptures. As they advanced step by step towards their destination, a flagpole suddenly appeared in front of them, with a head gruesomely hanging from it. The group stopped to discuss their next steps. Just as they finished planning, suddenly, the shattered ice caused Forsberg to fall into the water. While the others were figuring out how to rescue him, Caroline jumped into the ice hole and swam toward Forsberg. Unfortunately, Forsberg was already lifeless. Caroline could only retrieve the 2 canisters from Forsberg and swim back to the surface. The freezing lake left Caroline drenched, and the group quickly changed her clothes. Fearing the noise would alert the enemy, they didn't linger and continued their journey with Caroline. But in such temperatures, and being completely soaked, Caroline couldn't hold out for long, so they found a nearby house for shelter. Seeing no one inside, they quickly lit a fire. Nyland checked the canisters and found them intact. The group took a moment to rest. As Caroline woke up, she seemed to hear the sound of enemy aircraft, so she went outside to investigate. She saw Karimi crouching on the ground, sending a telegraph message. An enemy fighter jet was rapidly approaching through the clouds. Realizing the danger, Caroline quickly woke everyone, and they extinguished the fire and fled to the edge of the woods. Fortunately, the fighter jet overhead didn't spot them. However, the small house they had just hidden in was obliterated. They watched the terrifying scene from the side. Seeing they were safe, Caroline quickly pointed her gun at Karimi. She had seen Karimi on the phone when the enemy helicopter approached. Karimi tried to grab the gun from Caroline, but Malik pinned him down, holding a knife to Karimi's throat. Demanding to know if he was a traitor, Karimi claimed he was trying to contact his girlfriend at the base to see if she was still alive, nothing more. Suddenly, they heard a commotion. It was the enemy patrol coming to investigate. The group quickly took cover. Luckily, the enemy didn't find them, and so they began their mission again. Crossing the endless ice, clusters of buildings were covered in frost. Night fell quickly. Suddenly, Karimi, who was skating ahead, tripped over a small bump on the ice. Karimi tries to get up, but when he looks at the ice, he sees something horrifying. The group looked over and saw that beneath the ice were countless frozen corpses, stretching endlessly. The bodies were in various grotesque positions, as if they had endured great torment before death. The group was stunned by the sight, but with a mission to complete, they couldn't stay there for long, so they continued toward their destination. After walking for a while, they came to a snowdrift and took a rest. They were discussing what could have happened to the bodies they saw earlier when, suddenly, a helicopter appeared in the sky. Under the night sky, the helicopter ignored the others and targeted Caroline with gunfire. Luckily, Caroline maneuvered into the blind spot of the helicopter's searchlight and slipped under a broken bridge, narrowly escaping. The team has also come together here. Once the helicopter flew away, they headed to a nearby village to spend the night. Unexpectedly, they discovered people inside one of the houses. Seeing they were just ordinary civilians, the group felt relieved. An elderly couple shared some food with Caroline and her group. As they ate and drank, enjoying their conversation, Caroline accidentally knocked over her cup. Bending down to pick up her spoon, she noticed a machine gun hidden under the table. Caroline signaled to the man in front of her not to make any sudden moves. But then, just as Nyland was checking if everyone was injured, he discovered that Malik had been shot, and beside him, Karimi had already shown no signs of life. Suddenly, the satellite phone beside them rang, and a woman's voice came through, asking for Karimi. Caroline and the others were at a loss, guessing that this must be Karimi's girlfriend, Granvik. Trying to maintain composure, asked who she was and why she was looking for Karimi. The woman on the phone said that she was Karimi's girlfriend. Seeing this, Nyland stepped forward and said that Karimi was still sleeping and that he would pass on the message. After saying this, he hung up the phone. At that moment, they realized that Karimi had not lied, and a sense of guilt arose, but it was too late to do anything about it, and they had no choice but to continue their journey to Ad. All they had to accompany them, apart from each other, was the endless ice field. Because Malik had been shot, the long trek made his condition worse. They took shelter in front of a snowdrift to check Malik's wound. Seeing blood flow continuously from it, they knew they had to find a refuge to maintain Malik's body temperature. Fortunately, Caroline, who was walking ahead, found an abandoned cargo ship. After confirming it was safe, They brought Malik inside. They then discussed what to do next. If they took Malik with them, they certainly wouldn't be able to reach Ed by dawn. It would take at least a week. The group had no choice but to leave Malik with food and water, and his survival would be up to fate. Hearing this, Granvik took out the objective of the mission they were escorting, and wanted to see what was inside the jar. So Granvik opened the jar. Inside was a bottle of virus. Caroline and Nyland looked at it in amazement. It seemed that this thing could not only help them win a war but also win everything. But as soldiers, their task was to obey orders, so they temporarily set the matter aside and began to inspect the ship. When Caroline reached the deck, she saw a beam of light in the distance on the ice. Suddenly, a gunshot rang out, and Caroline hurried back to the cabin to find that Malik had shot himself. It seemed Malik didn't want to be a burden to everyone. Seeing this, Caroline told them about the distant light, warning that if the gunshot was heard, this place was not safe. The remaining two teammates struggled with whether to continue the mission. After all, it was a matter of life and death. But Caroline had a reason she had to go to add her daughter was there, so Caroline continued the mission alone. Soon, Caroline reached a thin layer of ice and poked at it with an ice pick, only to have it shatter with the slightest touch. Helpless, Caroline chose to slide lightly across the surface. However, the ice couldn't support Caroline's weight, so she had to lie down to distribute her weight more evenly. Fortunately, Nyland and Granvik followed and threw a rope over, pulling Caroline back from the brink of death. The enemy lights grew closer, and they had to rely on the rope to slowly move across the thin ice. Suddenly, the ice beneath Granvik cracked. They all had to lie down and slowly pull Granvik forward. At that moment, a flare lit up the sky, turning night into day, and they were exposed to the enemy. Next, it was time to see just how strong a sniper's mental fortitude could be. Bullets flew around Granvik. Nyland kept urging Granvik, but Granvik remained calm. Caroline hurried toward a small island ahead. When she reached the enemy camp, she found that the person they had just killed was the only one alive. The other two had frozen to death. They sat together by a fire, enjoying the only bit of warmth in the bitter cold. Nyland told them to sleep first, and they obediently complied. At dawn, Caroline woke to find Nyland gone, and he had taken the container with the virus. Caroline got up to see if Nyland had gone far, but a gunshot rang out. Luckily, Caroline dodged just in time and wasn't hit. Caroline quickly woke Granvik, and they began to fight back. Thanks to their coordinated efforts, they nearly finished off the enemies. Caroline was about to throw the last grenade to end the battle when an enemy appeared and shot her. The grenade in Caroline's hand fell to the ground, and Granvik quickly blocked it with his body. Caroline was blown away by the explosion. By the time Caroline reacted, Granvik was already in a pool of blood. In the end, Caroline could only endure her injuries and chase after Nyland. Luckily, she eventually caught up with him. Nyland heard Caroline calling, but he didn't want to stop. With no other option, Caroline shot at Nyland. Since the container was with Nyland, if she couldn't get it back, she wouldn't be able to find her daughter. Fortunately, Caroline was using a sniper rifle and hit Nyland in the arm. As Caroline approached, she demanded Nyland hand over the container, but Nyland insisted that they must destroy the container. There was open water ahead, or everyone would die. Caroline stubbornly insisted on her plan and continued toward Ad with the container, but her severe injuries, the long trek, and the relentless blizzard caused her to start hallucinating. At that moment, two men on horseback appeared ahead and took Caroline away. When Caroline regained consciousness, she found herself in a hospital, too weak and suffering from frostbite. She cautiously observed her surroundings. The doctor explained her situation. She had reached Ad, and it was their men who had brought her back. Caroline was then groomed and dressed, and she was brought before a group of high-ranking officials who were in a meeting. Caroline slowly walked up to Admiral Nord. Then Nord began to praise Caroline, saying how incredible she was for crossing hundreds of kilometers of ice with just a pair of skates, and she did it all while surrounded by enemies. Nord promoted Caroline, but Caroline knew she had survived because she wanted to see her daughter. She didn't care about these honors, so Caroline hurriedly asked Nord where her daughter was, but Nord replied that Caroline's previous motivation had been her drive to get there, and that hope had brought her this far. So Vanya was not here. Hearing this, Caroline finally couldn't hold back. The motivation she had clung to for so long turned out to be just a leader's ploy. Caroline lunged at Nord, pinning her to the ground, furiously swinging her fists. Trying to vent all the suffering she had endured on this woman, injured Nyland quickly pulled Caroline off. In the end, Caroline could only watch Nord leave, and she could only let out furious roars. With Nyland's support, they staggered back to the rest area. People on the way treated them kindly. To them, Caroline and Nyland were heroes who brought hope. However, upon returning, Caroline thought about discussing with Nyland how they could destroy the virus, because her daughter wasn't there. If the military succeeded in their research, her daughter, if still alive, would also die. Nyland argued they were both too crippled to take on an entire army, but Caroline said she could take advantage of the fact that everyone sees them as heroes. So they headed toward the experimental base. Sure enough, no one questioned Caroline and Nyland along the way. However, they didn't know the way to the laboratory, so Nyland resorted to his mind games.
Visa oss vägen till laboratoriet. Behöver jag hjälp?
Nej, kapten.
Bra. Eskortera oss dit.
Ja, kapten.
Caroline and Nyland managed to reach the lab. As soon as the steel door opened, one of the staff headed across the room. Caroline and Nyland followed, but two guards appeared at the door, not as easily fooled as the previous soldier, ready to call for reinforcements. Caroline couldn't wait any longer. She immediately pulled out a hidden weapon and took down the guards. She picked up a gun and grenades from the ground and headed straight into the lab. Under Caroline's armed threat, the staff led them to the core area and took out the virus. At that moment, the military had caught up. Caroline and Nyland set off the lab's alarm and donned protective suits to blend in with the escaping crowd. They reached the evacuation plaza. Nyland asked if the transport plane could take 2 more people, but Caroline was already surrounded. However, she had strapped bombs and the virus to herself. Making the military wary, Caroline signaled Nyland to stay back. Seeing this, Nyland understood Caroline's plan and left on the transport plane. Nord was still trying to persuade Caroline. However, knowing she had been deceived, Caroline was clearly determined to die. She jumped off the platform with the virus. The story ends here. This also shows us just how great a mother's love can be.